All right. Hello, JLOS fans. We are here today with Stephen Zhou to talk about one of his most recent articles in JLOS. And I want to start with my most basic question, Stephen. Can we just begin by hearing the 1 or 2 minute summary of your article?
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me. It's an honor to be here. So we published a paper titled Corporate Chief of Staff, Strategic Leadership Influence from Outside of the Spotlight. It's essentially one of the first pieces to take a look at this role of Chief of Staff, which we've heard of in military and government, but has really not been explored in the corporate context. And through our data gathering, through LinkedIn scraping and surveys and interviews, we're identifying that this chief of staff role actually has quite a bit of influence on strategic leadership in terms of decision making, top management team functions, and so forth, more so than you might expect. And so that's why we use the phrase outside the spotlight.
Exactly. So can you say a little more about what the implications might be of what you found for, if you think of, your typical sort of 200-person company, when you had these learnings about chiefs of staff, what would you tell companies to do with this information?
Yeah, especially with a smaller 200-person organization, you're probably not running a massive top management team with all sorts of layers of hierarchy, right? And you might consider, oh, maybe you have an executive assistant or administrative assistant. We're finding several notable things from these chiefs of staff when we talk to them and surveyed them. They're not just an executive assistant. So kind of the paper was breaking this notion that, oh, you just hire an EA to kind of get your calendaring done. And one of the best contrasts that we heard from one of our interviewees is you might have an assistant schedule your calendar invites, but the chief of staff is the one helping you decide or sometimes deciding for you who to talk to in the first place. So there's a nuance there, right? But that's really important because it directly influences who the CEO is talking to, what they're talking about. So as another example, the executive assistant might put in, I don't know, schedule the meeting for the top management team, but the chief of staff is putting the agenda together based on what they know of what the CEO wants and what the CEO needs to pay attention to. So, we get into detail on this on the paper, but it gets all into this idea of top management team functions, behavioral integration, CEO sense making. So it was fascinating to see this role touch upon all these theories that we talked about in upper echelon work for so many years. And really getting to them, going back to your question on this small 200-person organization, um, one quote that we got was, if you want to double the CEO's impact, you hire a chief of staff.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, of course, but certainly this idea that you need someone who's acting as the right-hand person for the CEO, who can represent the CEO and to basically do what the CEO would do in that situation, that has a huge amount of potential impact on the organization.
Oh, I love that. So maybe more of a strategic partner than an assistant.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
But behind the scenes, right there, you go to any company website, you don't see the chief of staff listed there. And frankly, most people don't think the chief of staff is a top management team member. So it's very much behind the scenes from outside of the spotlight. But again, if they're the ones controlling the calendar, they're the ones being the CEO's confidant on having just having brainstorming conversations on what should we do with this? What should we do with that? If they're the ones deciding what's going to be on the agenda or at least influencing what's going to be on the agenda for a board meeting, that has tremendous influence from a behind the scenes approach.
Oh, very cool. So you mentioned a couple of things you did already in order to conduct this research, but can you say a little more about who your participants are and how you did the whole study?
Yeah. So we got three different data sources. We started with about 2,500 LinkedIn profiles. So when we did a LinkedIn search, we ended up paying for like the Sales Navigator, fancy search tools. There are about 25,000 chiefs of staff on LinkedIn. So we got about 10% of them, did some randomization to check. And we scraped things like what's their current job title, their previous job title. So where did they come from? And just an interesting tidbit, only less than 4% of them were previously an executive assistant. Most of them came from previously being director, manager, sometimes even C-suite. Like there were chief operating officers who went to be a chief of staff. And so looked through all of those things and some basic demographics as well. And then I think the most exciting thing is we actually partner with the chief of staff organization. So we actually went to an organization, the person in charge of the organization, he's a co-author on the paper, Tyler Paris. So he is formally a chief of staff. He actually wrote a practitioner book for chief of staff on guidance on how to be and hire a chief of staff. And so he partnered with us and gave us access to his network to survey and interview. We surveyed about 100 chiefs of staff. We interviewed about a dozen of them. So, not huge data sets there, but getting straight to the source on talking to people who've done the work, who's actually doing the work, was really, really helpful in helping us understand what this role is. And we recognize that there's certainly other sources of data that will be helpful. And that's actually future plans. So if anyone listening is interested in future work, like we want to talk to actual CEOs who hire chiefs of staff. So to get the other perspective on what the chief of staff contributes or other top management team members. So certainly there's more work to be done on data collection. But in terms of a foundational initial approach to understanding the corporate role, we were very excited with the data that we collected.
Yeah, it's definitely a new area of research, something that people don't always think about, but it sounds like it can be extremely beneficial for leaders to think about, do I need a chief of staff, or what could I do if I had the strategic partner? So let me ask you, of all of that myriad findings, was there anything that really surprised you about your results?
Yeah, there's one thing that I think, so many things engage future research. Of course, I mentioned the chief of staff and how they engage in all the different theories that we've studied and talked about at length. But one thing that came out that was surprising, and there's a lot more that needs to be done here, is a gender component. So a vast majority of the chiefs of staff were identified as female. And actually, as we were discussing it with my co-authors, that could be considered in some ways a on one hand, a positive thing in the sense of this might be a great way to address the problems of the glass ceiling, if you will, and getting more underrepresented minorities into top leadership positions. So in some ways that might be a quote unquote positive thing, but in other ways it's also something that might have some old stereotypes involved because of what I mentioned that some people just think it's that this role is an executive assistant. So we don't try we talk about the gender component in our paper. We try to make it very clear we're not saying this is a great thing, let's go for it, nor are we condemning it, if you will. But it just certainly raises more questions on why are there such clear gender differences, both in the composition of who's in the role and also there were some interactions with what their prior job experience were and things like that. So it definitely necessitates future research to really understand how we can better support women in leadership roles.
It is an interesting point, and I have known a few chiefs of staff and someone who wanted to be a chief of staff, and all of them were women, and they're so strategic and so brilliant. It made me ask, like, why don't you want the head of, the head of the organization role, whatever that is
Yeah.
for the organization? I think it was the scrutiny or just that desire to be the behind the scenes person and not get beaten up all the time, not have to
Sure.
face
Yeah.
the downsides that sometimes people associate with leadership. But
Mhm.
it's cool to see it actually bear out in the data, not just in my anecdotal life of some women in chief of
Yeah.
staff roles.
Yeah.
Whatever made you get interested in this topic?
It came up earlier on. I was working with my advisor at the time when I was in the PhD program, Stephen Zaccaro, a book chapter for top management teams. And this idea came up as we were writing about different elements of the top management team. And then honestly, there's also just a personal element of I personally identify with this kind of capacity a lot. There's a lot of things that we discovered in this role that just spoke to me personally in terms of how I function, what I'd like doing. I do some nonprofit consulting, and in that consulting, I end up in this type of role a lot where I'm working very closely with whoever's in charge of the organization. And then there's one thing that also was really interesting. A lot of the interviewees and the survey respondents talked about or wrote about how diverse and how flexible the individual needs to be. Because on one hand, they're talking to the CEO and dreaming about the 30-year plan, but then 10 minutes later, they're trying to put together a quick slide deck for the board meeting. And then 30 minutes after that, they're meeting with a staff member just to kind of see why is that staff member upset? Does it need to go to the CEO or not, or so forth. So just the amount of variety in the job and what they end up having to do, it really keeps you on your toes. I personally love that kind of environment. That's what I've always ended up doing. I often find myself ending up in situations where there's someone else who's kind of, to your point, takes the heat and is the public face, and I'm trying to take their strategy and turn it into operations. I like taking strategy and making it happen. And so I had a personal connection just to the idea. And like you said, I've known of several chief of staff as myself as well. And I knew of what they did and was always fascinated with the role. So the idea that no one's really studied it in a corporate setting. It's always been studied in military and government. And sure, we can learn from that. There were definitely things that we learned from. But realistically, yeah, I mean, we saw McKinsey and Company, they produced some stuff about the topic. They've done some research in that area, but yeah, in terms of how we think in terms of strategic leadership, publications, and theory, it really has not incorporated the chief of staff role.
Interesting. So you kind of identify with the chief of staff role, but what would you do if you had your own chief of staff?
It would be really nice as I think about just the idea that somebody else could just do what I was thinking, and all I had to say is, "Hey, we need to, some of the examples they gave post-COVID, we need to decide how we're going to return to office,"
Uh-huh.
and just having somebody else implement it and know exactly the goals and also the style, right? Like the interviewee was talking about approaching in the right way, making sure employees didn't feel like they were being forced to return to office, but that they were communicating the importance of certain elements of it. So just even the subjective soft skills, if you will, that the idea that being able to trust somebody else to hand that off to, even in a research context, the idea of not just someone who runs data for you, but someone who actually partners with you to think through of a research topic and think strategically, if you will, through what kind of journal would this be a good fit for? How should this paper be positioned? Who should we partner with to get data? I know I'm kind of forcing it into a research
Yeah,
mindset, but it would be really fun to have a duplicate, basically. So
absolutely. And it could double your impact, right? As that
yeah,
one
that's what
quote
some people
said.
say. Yeah.
That would be huge. Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, so much for being our first guest to talk about the amazing research, including yours, published in the Journal of Leadership and Organizational Studies. We're going to look out for some commentary from chiefs of staff, other people to read the article. We're going to tell you more about Stephen in the links below, his bio and background. And then you can read the article itself, which we'll link in here. If this piqued your interest, please follow us on our LinkedIn page. We want to bring the hottest, most exciting leadership research into your LinkedIn feed so you know what's on trend. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you so much.